parents of a 14-year-old Indigenous girl who took her own life have spoken out about the bullying and racism she suffered before her death. Rochelle Pryor from Perth is among 5 Aboriginal girls who have died from suicide in the past fortnight in Western Australia, Queensland and South Australia. And last week, a 12-year-old Indigenous boy was being treated in a Brisbane hospital after a suicide attempt. Joining me now to discuss this is Jerry Georgatis, the head of the federal government's Indigenous Critical Response Team. Jerry, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Carolyn.
Well, 5 suicides in the past fortnight. Is this an epidemic in your view?
It's actually more than 5 suicides. There have been several more, but I'm not prepared to identify where, but of young children and youths less than 17 years of age. The youth and child toll in terms of suicides, Australian children, is an increasing crisis right across the nation, and that is a significant intersection with socioeconomic disadvantage and the pronounced negative and aberrant behaviours that sometimes come from within the most extreme poverty. But it's a much more pronounced elevated risk group, our First Nations children. They have been comprising 25 to 30% of the youth and child suicide toll less than 17 years of age and over the last decade. But that's increasing, and tragically it's a harrowing, sad tragedy. It's 40% in the last year, suicide-affected families that I've responded to,
40% of child suicides are Indigenous children, and yet they only represent about 5% of children in Australia. Why do you think they're so overrepresented?
There's a direct correlation between 2 rates that I'll give you. One's the suicide toll. In terms of suicides, First Nations people are 2.5 times that of the national population in terms of the suicide toll. The poverty rates, the Henderson poverty line, 14% of Australians live below the poverty line, the Henderson poverty line, and 40% of our First Nations brothers and sisters live below the poverty line. That is a 2.5 times differential. There's crushing poverty within that poverty for First Nations people that isn't a fundamental type of poverty for non-Indigenous Australians. But the direct correlation in terms of the disparity in terms of the suicide toll is driven by the disparity in the poverty rates. So to bring to parity the 2 rates, suicides and poverty, or suicides between First Nations people and the Australian population, we have to reduce the poverty to parity. We have to reduce the poverty to parity and get rid of the crushing poverty that many people, particularly remote living, are experiencing.
You've said that this could be the worst year on record for Aboriginal youth suicide. Why do you think it's getting worse?
Because of that crushing poverty. In the remote living, in particular, communities have been degraded by one government after another. The degradation of these communities isn't by the making of government. There's a failure for equivalency of service between First Nations communities and non-Aboriginal communities that are nearby. So there is a vacuum of services. 8 out of 10 children, like I say, in these remote living communities do not complete Year 12. So what hope then for navigating rest of life settings, mainstream and their own? But people are led to live in hovels of human misery, and the degradation of these communities is a crushing poverty, and there are pronounced negative behaviours, aberrant and otherwise. And look, I have to take it to the Australian audience. 1/3 of the suicides of young First Nations children have been identified alongside child sexual abuse. Child sexual abuse is something that affects all Australians, all humanity. It's a narrative that's been with us historical, but where we've got crushing poverty, where we've got the degradation of communities, where we've got hovels of human misery, where we've got lives where there's no hope on the horizon, there are negative aberrant behaviours, and what we actually need to respond to them is in-person support, psychosocial support, the redefining of traditional forms of psychosocial support, where we relentlessly support individuals, young and older, with early intervention to disable the trauma of child sexual abuse or of other abuses or of other neglects and deprivations, and support them to improve their life circumstance. We don't need a response to disaster like the Northern Territory emergency intervention, where it became punitive. What we need is positive affirmation. What we need is positive support. What we need is to work with people, and all the evidence rests with that. And this is what I do, and we improve life circumstance and keep people well, there's no greater legacy that any government can have than to improve a lot of others to the point of saving lives.
You mentioned crushing poverty, and no doubt that's a huge contributing factor. In Rochelle Pryor's case, the young girl who I mentioned at the start of this segment, the 14-year-old who took her life in Perth, she had reportedly been bullied and the victim of racism. How big a problem is that?
So my colleagues are supporting the family, but I can't talk to the particulars of the family, but I can talk generically. Bullying and the isms, racism, classism, sexism, they do exist. They're pronounced, and they're much more pronounced amongst the socioeconomically disadvantaged. And racism is felt toxically by First Nations brothers and sisters, by migrant-born Australians. And let us not forget the migrant-born Australians. Of the 3,128 suicides registered in the last count, nearly one-third of our migrant-born Australians. And the socioeconomic disadvantage is a driver, a cesspool narrative in that. But the isms of classism and racism and the presumption that people have to fit into a homogenous society rather than a polycultural society do affect people psychosocially. They take people from a psychosocial positive self to a psychosocial negative self. And our trauma recovery is bent on actually supporting people positively. But sometimes the damage is irreparable. This is why early intervention is paramount, particularly for children and youth.
Okay, Jerry Georgiadis, really appreciate your time on such an important issue.
Much respect, Caroline. Thank you.
Support from these organisations is available for anyone who may be feeling distressed. You can call the SANE helpline on 1800 187 263, Lifeline